Surprising absolutely no one, Regieleki is now banned from Scarlet and Violet OU after it was released in Pokemon Home earlier this week. That makes it the first quick ban since the OU ladder went up. Regieleki has historically been a powerful electric-type Pokemon, with its claim to fame being that it's the fastest Pokemon ever. It's so fast that even most Choice Scarf Pokemon or Shell Smash Pokemon don't outspeed it. Its power looks modest at first glance, after all it only has a base 100 special attack, but its ability Transistor gives it a ridiculous 1.5 times boost to electric-type attacks. This is a pretty ridiculous level of power and speed. With Volt Switch, it can rip large amounts of damage off you and then move into a Pokemon with an even better matchup. 2-hit KOs are the standard metric for evaluating an offensive Pokemon because it measures how well a Pokemon can switch into it. A defensive Pokemon has to be able to switch in to tank a hit, and then take another hit as it gets outsped for it to be considered effective. Regieleki's Thunderbolt is no slouch and it's strong enough to get 2-hit KOs on neutral Pokemon. However, all this being said, Regieleki has always had one fatal flaw, and that is that it has no way to touch Ground-type Pokemon. Ground types are incredibly common in every meta. For one, most teams need a ground type to stop Volt Switch. Regieleki is not the only electric type in the format, and Volt Switch spam has been a very common idea since day one. You need to be able to stop Volt Switch's momentum game, otherwise you lose pretty easily to strong Volt Switch pivots. Second, ground types are easy to fit on most teams anyway. Most ground-type Pokemon learn Stealth Rock and Stab Earthquake, and there happens to be very good ground types in every generation, like Garchomp or Landorus T. As a result, even though Regieleki is crazy strong and fast, it's inherently limited by its Achilles heel. In Generation 8, Regieleki actually managed to stay in the OU tier despite that flaw. It had two movesets, a heavy-duty boots pivot moveset, and a support-based moveset built around Reflect and Light Screen. Regieleki's power is so demanding that you often had to use a ground-type Pokemon to deal with it, and that was something you could play around. For example, support movesets could bait in a ground-type to come in, and then use Reflect and Light Screen on them, and then explode into a setup sweeper. You could build your team intentionally with a Pokemon like Shell Smash Cloyster, who matches up well versus ground-type Pokemon. Beyond that, a lot of teams relied on Landorus T to accomplish a lot of its roles, and you can try and overload the Landorus so Regieleki can easily sweep in the late game. You also had other ideas like comboing Regieleki with Defiant Zapdos Galar. Because Regieleki demands the ground type, you can predict that switch and go to Zapdos Galar for an attack boost. Regieleki was not a top threat, but it was OU caliber back in Gen 8. It's important to understand that Regieleki's entire build is predicated on the idea that it's a total demon, but with an Achilles heel that prevents it from being too strong. The entire design is that of a Pokemon who does everything except beat ground-type Pokemon. However, that's not true anymore in Generation 9 with Terastalization. Now, Regieleki can Terra Ice, Terra Blast, and break those ground-type Pokemon. Regieleki now has the legendary Bolt Beam coverage, a term that's used to describe the coverage of Thunderbolt plus Ice Beam, which is almost perfect. Only Arctozolt and Rotom Frost has ever had Stab Electric and Stab Ice before. With this dual stab combination, Regieleki can destroy ground types like Landorus, Great Tusk, or Garchomp. Regieleki's speed and power make it a 2-hit KO threat on almost everything. There are only a few relevant checks like Ting Lu or Iron Treads, and even they can be overwhelmed over time. Because being another type like Grass doesn't stop the Volt Switch positioning spam, and it's weak to Ice anyway. Similarly, putting a random Assault Vest on a non-ground type Pokemon doesn't solve much either because you haven't tackled the root issue of Volt Switch. That's really the core of what makes Regieleki broken. Bolt Beam coverage with that powerful Volt Switch. Terastalization makes ground types unreliable. An often used defensive idea for offensive teams is to use Choice Scarf Pokemon to outspeed powerful threats. Even if these offensive Pokemon don't have a great defensive stat, they can outplay and bring in these frail attackers through a type advantage. However, you can't do that here because Regieleki outspeeds all Choice Scarf Pokemon anyway. Offense has such a rough go versus a Pokemon that is as fast as Regieleki. You're basically pigeonholed into highly defensive strategies with a few Pokemon that can take on Regieleki. One idea is to use your own Terra type defensively to beat Regieleki. You could use a Pokemon weak to Electric to bait Regieleki, and then surprise Terra Ground and knock it out. This is a nice idea, but is tough to execute in practice. That's because Regieleki also runs Substitute for these situations. Substitute lets Regieleki bait out Terra Ground and other pivot switching ideas. If you Terra Ground on a Substitute, you're back at square one because you wasted your Terastalization, and you're still weak to the Bolt Beam coverage. Substitute is also good versus Sucker Punch, the most common priority move. Regieleki is a bit of a Terra Hog, which is not ideal. Ideally, you don't want to use Pokemon that need Terastalization to be effective, because then it limits your flexibility in which Pokemon you can Terastalize. But here, the payoff of Bolt Beam Regieleki is so high that the reward is worth the loss in flexibility. It's not a complete Terra Hog, because sometimes the threat of Terastalization is enough to be effective, and normal Terra Blast can still pick off weak ground types, but the resource allocation is worth talking about. Regieleki with Terastalization is so much better than everything around it, and it was a no-brainer to ban it. Regieleki now joins the rank of Ubers as the first Pokemon banned during Pokemon Home. What's your favorite returning Pokemon to use so far? Let me know down in the comment section below.